I'm Richard Hefner, your host on The Open Mind, and my guest today is a most accomplished and prolific social critic whose earlier works, such as The Minimal Self and particularly The Culture of Narcissism, have long since established him as foremost among those who would identify what is, in truth, the promise of American life. Christopher Lasch teaches history at the University of Rochester, and someone has suggested that in his writings about America past and particularly present, he seems persistently to reverse the plea of that old Johnny Mercer song to accentuate the positive, eliminate the negative. Indeed, his readers may find that observation particularly apt in parsing Professor Lasch's newest and perhaps most demanding and brilliantly all-encompassing volume of social and cultural criticism, The True and Only Heaven, just published by W. W. Norton. How could it be otherwise when his very first sentences are, "This inquiry began with a deceptively simple question. How does it happen that serious people continue to believe in progress in the face of massive evidence that might have been expected to refute the idea of progress once and for all?" Well, the late great historian Charles A. Beard noted that all recounted history is an act of faith, so that I would first ask my guest today if the question with which he begins, "The True and Only Heaven," reflects that act of faith that informs his own image of America's past and present, perhaps even our future too. Professor Lasch?
Hard question, because nobody really is comfortable with Beard's assertion. Now, not even Beard. No, of course not. I want to say this is no act of faith. This assertion that progress is a delusion rests on unimpeachable evidence. But I can't quite say that, because having gone to school with Charles A. Beard, as it were, I don't mean that he was my teacher in any direct sense, I know, like other historians, that there is a great deal of truth in his insistence that any narrative is organized by an initial set of assumptions that is not, can't be reduced to any simple set of empirical generalizations.
Now, after you say that, is this an act of faith in any way on your part? This, I believe, is what others have said.
Well, I hadn't, as a matter of fact, thought much about this issue at all. I thought that the idea of progress was something that was no longer taken seriously, that had no intellectual respectability. I assumed that the First World War had dealt it a blow from which it had not recovered. And then I was asked to speak at a conference on technology and to give a talk specifically on the status of the idea of progress in our time. And after I began to read, I saw that this was not true. That it's true that the idea of progress had a hard time in the 20s, in the immediate aftermath of World War I. Apart from Beard, who published vigorous defenses of the idea of progress in the 20s, there weren't many serious intellectuals. On the contrary. Well, J.M. Bury's classic study, The Idea of Progress, was published right after the war, and it was premised, I think, on the assumption that it was possible to write a history of the idea of progress because it was over, because the idea was history, because no one took it seriously. And Beard's position was very much a minority position at that time. However, after the Second World War, the idea of progress, which you might have expected to make the idea of progress more untenable than ever, made a startling comeback for very interesting reasons. I think in part because it now seemed to be the only antidote to complete despair, but also in part because, after all, devastating as World War II was, and deeply disturbing as all of its revelations about the capacity of organized, highly civilized societies to perpetrate the most barbarous things, still the economic boom that followed World War II was absolutely unprecedented. And it was a not just an American thing, but a tremendous period of economic expansion in which all industrial nations were caught up. This initial, and this is how I think interesting inquiries often happen. You set out with one set of expectations and they're confuted by the evidence that you dig up. It's sort of unwelcome evidence.
Do you think this nation could support intellectually, emotionally, the idea that progress is no more?
Well, what gives me hope that it can is the existence of an older tradition, quite an old tradition in our political culture, that has always been skeptical of the idea of progress, or as people used to speak in the 19th century, skeptical of the idea of improvement. Now, it was again, it was never dominant, this tradition, which included some very well-known people. I would classify Emerson, for example, in this tradition, in this skeptical tradition, in spite of his tendency at times to identify himself with the party of hope rather than the party of memory. Many of the, another thing, you put it this way, another thing that I learned this time in the course of teaching 19th century history to students, undergraduates, is that the democratic forces in American society in the 19th century, democratic with the small d, were not necessarily friends of improvement. We tend to think of that the more democratic, the more committed you are to radical democracy, the more you're likely to be progressive. But these were not by any means equivalent in the 19th century. In fact, if anything, the reverse, the democratic forces in American society were craftsmen, artisans, small businessmen, farmers, whose mode of production was in serious jeopardy, who were perceived themselves threatened by the tendency toward large-scale production. And not only for that reason, but for others as well, were very dubious about the assumption that the general movement of history is always upward and onward.
Which, of course, leads me to ask you what I hope you won't feel is an impertinent question. But why do you write? Why do you teach? How can you write? How can you teach if you do not believe in the idea of progress?
Because I believe in hope as opposed to optimism.
A distinction that I've
Yes,
tried
indeed.
to explain in this book.
But with a difference? It is a distinction, but tell me about
Oh yeah,
the
there's a difference. Optimism, I mean, the terms don't mean anything, but the state of mind that they're meant to capture, that this distinction is meant to capture, is a real difference. Optimism, as I call it, is the state of mind of people who believe in progress. It depends on a certain reading of history and the assumption that no matter what happens, and with minor setbacks, things are going to get better. Hope is the state of mind of people who have, it's a kind of, it should be thought of, I think, not so much as an assessment of the direction of historical change, as a kind of temperamental quality, almost a character trait. It's the state of mind of people who believe in the goodness of life and in some kind of underlying justice in the universe, in spite of evidence to the contrary. I mean, in spite of all the evidence that would justify cynicism and despair. So I think of hope as it's as this description may suggest, it's a religious quality. It doesn't need to be attached to any formal creed, but it is the state of mind that I think religious traditions refer to when they talk about faith.
If we had not just come out of a decade in which the idea of progress was so clearly and so thoroughly identified with material things, would you pick up the cudgels as you have?
Yes, for this reason. I don't want to argue that it's only bound up with material things. You're quite right about the 80s. But I want to, it's always important, in fact, to confront one's opponents, to confront ideas you don't like in their most compelling form, so that it's easy enough to indict an ideology in its crudest forms, in this case the crude materialism of the 80s. But historically, the idea of progress, which I claim originated in the 18th century, specifically in 18th century political economy, which ties the increase in human wants and tastes to increasing productivity and increasing consumption, and hence gives the belief in an ever-expanding abundance, an ever-expanding productive machinery, some solid basis, in fact.
But couldn't one say that that was a bastardization of the idea of progress?
Well,
of the heavenly city of the 18th century philosophy?
But I don't want to argue that this was only a materialistic belief. On the contrary, I mean, Adam Smith, who's quite clear about this, makes it explicit that when he talks about productivity, he is also interested in the expansion of human culture that is required to support an increasingly productive system, so that this vision of a marvelously productive machine based on an endlessly expanding demand for what once were luxuries monopolized by the privileged. These new wants included taste for not just material comforts and conveniences, but the tastes that go along with education, with rising levels of taste, and so on. So that it's a quite generous belief that has plenty of moral content as well as material.
You say moral content.
Yeah, I assume that the expansion of ordinary people's tastes and their capacity to enjoy the finer things of life, I assume that is a morally, it's a sentiment that we would approve of on moral grounds.
A moral sentiment, but you say approve of. You seem in this book and in others to have related material progress to the degree that it is related to materialism and otherwise to a diminution of the moral standards.
Well, there are two things that give me pause about this imposing body of belief, which has been dominant in our culture for a long time. One is the fear that since the whole thing is premised on a seemingly limitless abundance, this premise may be highly questionable in an age when more and more attention has to be paid to ecological limits. I concede that this in itself is a controversial issue, and that not everybody agrees about this. I haven't tried to argue that case. I've simply assumed it.
But you would. You've made the assumption.
Yeah, that this can't go on indefinitely. The attempt to, the democratization of luxury, if you will, has built-in limits. Imagine what it would mean to export the American standard of living to the rest of the world. So that's one reservation. But the other one, perhaps more serious reservation, has to do with the notion of democracy that seems to me to be bound up with the idea of progress. It's essentially, what this assumes is a democracy of consumers, when there's any democratic content at all. Often there isn't, as in the great, as in the decade of the 80s, when the democratic content of the progressive vision had sort of receded from view altogether. But insofar as it's there, what's envisioned is a democracy of consumers. The other tradition that I'm eager to rescue envisions a democracy of citizens and producers. That is, it rests on a much more active notion of democracy.
How in the world would you rescue that notion?
Well, many of the values that are associated with that tradition such sort of rock-bottom beliefs as that people should assume the responsibility for their own actions, or a belief that strong families are good things. These beliefs are still quite widespread in our society, which gives me some hope that it's not utterly utopian to think that they might be due for a revival. Then, too, it's not clear whether the tendency toward large-scale production, which is a large part of this story, I think, is likely to continue. On the contrary, what may be happening is that the age of production for mass markets may be reaching its end. It's possible that more and more production is going to have to be geared to highly specialized markets for which the old techniques of mass production, Fordism, assembly line, where you turn out masses of standardized and uniform products. Maybe that is coming to an end. Several, serious economists have argued to this effect. There are parts of the world, there's a revival of sort of small-scale, almost artisanal production in northern Italy, for example, which is highly compatible with the most advanced technology. The recent industrial history of Japan suggests a somewhat similar combination.
But you